This is Superintendent Justin Dahlheimer. I'm going to go through the slides I presented at the Truth in Taxation meeting on December 18th, 2023. This gives an overview of the school district from a financial perspective and talks through the reasoning the board approved the levy that was set at that meeting. I think it's informative for taxpayers who've received their statements and maybe couldn't make the meeting to understand how the school decides to set their levy and why your property taxes go up annually for the school purposes. The major theme of the meeting was a discussion over the fund balance situation at Osakas Public School. And I don't want you concerned that it's in a bad situation. We are more managing to a policy that the board sets to keep appropriate amount of rainy day funds available, called our general unassigned fund balance, at a level where we can cover at a minimum 2 months of our general fund expenses. And due to the cash flow from the state and where our revenue comes from, it's important that we have excess reserves so that way we can manage any ups and downs in that cash flow. As you can see on this table, we have been a very high fund balance district up until the last 2 years. And the things that happened over the last 2 years was we paid for improvements to our facility that we'd been saving money for over the past, could be more than a decade, really, because they were needed changes that we agreed through a planning process we needed to make. Unfortunately, what that does do is it spends down our savings account, and then we have to manage at a lower level the funds that we have available for any unanticipated expenses or any deficits to our budget. So it's important that we always start with the resources that we have and look at how we're going to be using them in the future. And we did talk through a lot of that in our referendum, so we hope all the information that was put out there gave people an understanding that what we're trying to do is balance the amount of funding we have coming from the state on an annual basis and the amount of need we have and what that we ask of our taxpayers to help kind of meet that gap or future plan for our facility. So I talked through that our fund balance is very important, but really the revenue that was approved at the state level passed in May at the last legislative session had a lot of revenue coming into districts, but had a lot of mandates. And where those mandates tend to show up is in our restricted fund balances, where we have to use those funds specifically for what the state says we need to use those for. And that does limit what we can do from a savings standpoint to plan for some of the improvements that we need to make generally, and that we have to look at our excess reserves that don't have restrictions and keep them available in the case we have things that come up that need to be covered, or they're, like I said, shortages from the state because of a budget situation where they're holding back funds to districts for a period of time. And then the other item that we talked about was the amount of money we still have left from our CARES and ESSER funds, which is the money that was given to school districts during COVID. We've been very prudent with that money. We still have 670,000 available. That is limited in what we can do with it, but we're definitely going to be making best use of it in the near future as it does expire in next September. So all that said, we're really trying to get that 1.6 months of operating expenses back to our minimum of 2 months, and we need to do that through proper budgeting. And we also need to manage the long-term facility costs that we talked through in our referendum and how we plan to address these identified issues, and really spread the amount of what could be up to $40 million of improvements that need to be made in the long-term future for the school to be thriving and to be what the community has determined it needs to be. So we did have a recently failed referendum for the projects we put together in that structure. We're clearly going to be reworking that and working with the community on a package that they think is favorable so we can spread these facility costs over the long term in a way that's much more responsible and efficient for our taxpayers. And our budget, which we approve every June, it really captures the picture of what the district does with the money. And as you can see, it's pretty evenly spread between a third in our high school, a third in our elementary, and then the remaining third really covers a lot of the overhead areas in district-wide expenses that we have, like consider like transportation's a major one, or you get into the food service area where we're definitely providing a decent amount of resources to give free food for all students. And there's other expenses that roll into that. You see debt redemption is a larger piece of the pie. And that's the money we use to pay back the bonds that we issue when we do facility improvements. The major thing to note in our budget is 68% of it is really people, salary and benefits. So when we have negotiations going on like we do in this budget year, they can make the budget we set in June need to be revisited and revised to take into account what happened during negotiations. And from a revenue perspective, when we talk to our local taxpayers, we like to focus on the fact that really 85% of our revenue comes from the state and another 3% comes from the federal. So we're really going to our taxpayers for 12% of what the revenue we need to run our school district, which isn't a large piece of the pie, but we know it's very important to every taxpayer. So we want to take them through a real patient process so they understand we're using their money well. And when we do go to them for that, like I said, meeting the gap that isn't being met by the state or federal government, it's for responsible things that have to get done to benefit our community and students. And the largest impact to that state aid is our pupil count, is the number of students we're bringing in on an annual basis to provide education and services to. And so we look really closely at our enrollment trends to really dictate how we're going to be budgeting for the upcoming year. And we're pretty conservative. So this is an accurate historical perspective of enrollment and how we look at it from the district standpoint. And I won't get into the details on how they count students, but we start the year at 851 students, and we need to plan for the following year in a responsible way. So we project it out, but we oftentimes cut this down about 10 to 15 students. So we're not putting ourselves in a scenario where if we have some students that don't come to our district or enroll in a different district, they don't shock our budget to the point where we're into those savings accounts and depleting our fund balance. The trend that Osakis is very focused on often is our open enrollment, meaning students coming from other districts. We've been pretty steady above 30% for the last 4 to 5 years, which means we're bringing in a lot of students outside the district to provide revenue in our budgets that allow us to operate our school in a way which benefits our resident students with more services, different types of curriculum that probably we couldn't offer if we had to have a limited amount of teachers. So it's really important that we continue to keep our student levels in a steady place, and open enrollment has allowed us to really meet those needs despite the fact that we've had a pretty consistently stable resident enrollment, but not growing at the pace at which we would expect some of the demands on our school and the services we provide. So it's really to be said that open enrollment is very beneficial to the school district, and we should think of it as a revenue driver that brings wealth and resources to our school that doesn't have to come out of our local taxpayers' pockets. The trend in open enrollment that I'd like to focus on too is that early childhood in our younger population has been growing in recent years. You can see just even looking at across the board in our 4-year-old population, we're up 13 preschool students, I guess is what we consider 4-year-olds, over the last 2 years. And every level is starting to trend to be a bigger group of kids. And those would be resident kids at those ages. And so when this combines into a budget, we do need to look at the budget we approved and make sure that we're not approving a budget that's more expenses than revenue, which we haven't, but also making adjustments based on what we know as the year goes on, and we can dial in kind of the impact of either the services we're providing, the number of students we're reaching, or any changes that have come mid-year that we weren't able to budget for. So as you see, the adjustments to expenditures and revenue capture that, and we're still looking to be consistently positive for this year, but we do have a lot of long-term unknowns that we need to factor in when we look at setting levies, because our levy doesn't bring the revenue that we agree to set it at until 18 months later. So the decision we make on Truth and Taxation Night doesn't affect the current year we're in for our budget. It affects the next year. So we're considering things like what revenue is doing next year, which is going up 2%, according to the state and the legislative session. But that, again, is only on 85% of our revenue, not 100%. So we know that that's not quite 2% revenue across the board. We also know that they're going to give us more money for special education services we provide, but they haven't been specific on what that actually means and what that's going to supplement our budgets with. So we're looking for guidance on that. And finally, there are some unknowns that are eventually going to hit our taxpayers, which is providing unemployment for any employee that is not with the district during the summer. They allowed that this last legislative session, and it costed us up to $65,000. And if we have to continue to do that and pay for it, that will be an expense borne solely by our taxpayers in the future. We at Finance Committee, which consists of 3 board members and myself, agreed that this was a year where we needed to levy at the max limit that we're allowed, which would raise our levy 5.39%. And the reasons being are listed here, and we were talked about during the referendum, that one way or another we have to start building that fund balance up in the event we have to tackle some long-term costs with some of that savings, but also how are we going to continue to grow and make large capital purchases when we do run out of the ESSER funds that we've been utilizing to make those capital purchases in the past. So to be responsible, we want to keep a good situation budget-wise that allows some growth to the fund balance and allows us to start pointing that savings in the directions that tackle our long-term goals and long-term costs. And we also look at levy from the perspective of it brings aid from the state. And this will show you kind of how much aid we bring in with every levy type that hits your property taxes. And they don't hit this way in this detail. I'm showing this detail so you understand, how much bang for your buck we're getting when we levy our taxpayers. So on average, we're getting 23.5 cents for every dollar we levy, which unfortunately, this is one place where legislators haven't been friendly to school districts, is in the last 3 years, we've seen that buying power, so to speak, move down. It was at 37% in 2022, and we're down to 23.5%. And the reason for that is all of our property tax bases have gotten larger statewide, and they haven't looked at how our district's property tax base compares to the richest and made adjustments like they usually do, so that way we get benefit for having a smaller property tax base than, say, a large district like Edina. And they haven't done that in a few years, and there's been just rapid amounts of inflation hitting property values, which means they need to readjust this so that way more of your levy goes further for our district in aid. And the decision the board made to go to that 5.39% increase for this year is going to hit everybody differently. So I encourage everybody to look at their property tax statement and key in on what your value did over the course of the year, which this is my property tax statement, and my home value went up approximately $15,000, which is a large reason for any adjustments on my property taxes. Why I'm paying more this year than last year, excuse me. And you can also go down to where the school district's approved levies are set. And you can look across the board and you can see our voter approved levies, which is what we go to the taxpayers for, which is what we recently went with to the taxpayers in November, and it failed. The existing levy is still on our books, and it actually went down this year for me. And that's because the property tax base grew, and the amount of bonding that went into that levy spread across the tax base differently. And it was more favorable for my property, but it may have gone up for somebody else. But that is one reason why voter approved levies are really efficient for taxpayers, is because oftentimes our residential taxpayers will see a reduction over time due to different state aid opportunities and different ways the tax base grows. Now, on the other local levies, that's what we're talking about in our Truth in Taxation meeting, and that's what the board approved at the 5.39% increase. That went from $402 for me to $422. So the 5.39% increase to our levy meant $20 more for me this year. But I also got a $9 savings in the voter approved, so $11 more for the decision that was made. And I know I'm just talking about my specific situation, but I really encourage you to find this statement that should have came to you in the mail and go through this when you look at your school levy. And it's probably good to go through it with all the other levies on there, but today I'm only focusing on this. And if you still have questions and you're really wondering why everything went up on your tax statement, really focus on the fact that our market values over the last 2 years went up 16% in 2022 and 20.6% last year. That's a huge increase, and that's probably going to be the main reason why you feel like you have more taxes on your property than you had ever. And unfortunately, the school district doesn't control what your property value is worth. We do like to believe we're a major contributor for you having a high property value or a higher property value than you had the previous year. And we think that's a sign of a healthy school district. But if you have concerns specifically over your property value, that's where we would say you need to look into the process where they give you your valuation notice in March, and they give you an appeal process at the county and township and city level to talk through any specific things with your property that you might disagree with. And that's going to be really governed by your county assessor's office. It's not going to have anything to do with the school district. But I did mention that there is something that you could reach out to your local legislators about, and that would be discussing when I mentioned that your levy's not going as far as it used to for aid. And that would be talking over equalization tiers and how they're comparing our school district's property value base to others. And that may be worth making a phone call, because I don't think it is fair that the Osakis Public School District property value base hasn't been adjusted with respect to the most expensive property tax bases in the state. And if you made a phone call and made your legislators pay attention to that, they may be able to advocate for something that in the future will reduce the burden on you. So if you have any other questions, please reach out to me. I've provided a lot of information in here, and I don't expect everyone to get it right away, but do know a lot of thought goes into how we set our levy, and our board went through a very extensive process in making that decision. And I appreciate anybody who's interested and who cares about this and has future questions to route them to the district office, and I will show you the information we're using to make that decision. Thank you.